Hey, and welcome to the Short Stuff. I'm Josh, and there's Chuck. Jerry's here, Dave's here. You know how Dave's here. And this is Short Stuff.
That's right. This is a shorty from Dave Roos, still a contributor to HowStuffWorks.com, which is great. And this one, everyone, we want to issue a big trigger warning. It is about the Aokigahara Forest in Japan. It has another name that people have called it, the Suicide Forest. And we're going to be talking about that in this episode. And obviously that's a very touchy subject. We don't want anyone to be unnecessarily triggered by it. So don't listen if it's not your jam. And obviously if you have some deep-seated issues going on in your life and you've had these kinds of thoughts, you should call 988, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline.
Yeah, good call, Chuck. Get it? Yeah. Good call.
That's right.
So one of the other names for the Aokigahara forest is the Jukai, which means the sea of trees. And it's because it's a huge swath of forest, just an enormous forest. Yeah, that flanks Mount Fuji, has beautiful views of Mount Fuji. It's about a couple hours drive from Tokyo. And I think it built up over like a lava flow that from an eruption in 864. And one of the reasons that it's famous, not just for its views of Mount Fuji, but because, like you said, it's come to be known as the Suicide Forest because so many people travel to Aokigahara and never come out on purpose.
That's right. There are no statistics anymore, and I think this is great that the government of Japan has stopped. I don't know if they stopped counting, but they at the very least stopped listing out statistics on the number of suicides there. I think they stopped that in sort of the mid-20-teens. But needless to say, it had happened a lot. And so they said, we're not going to publish these numbers anymore, which is, I think, the right thing to do.
Right.
But where this all came from is sort of an interesting story because no one knows exactly what it is. We have some decent ideas. It's probably from these two books that came along much later, but for a while people said it might have been this practice from when was this actually?
The Shokusenbutsu?
Yeah, I didn't think I had a date on that.
I don't know, Chuck, but it said that it's been going on for at least 1,000 years, or that it went on for 1,000 years. So it went back quite a while.
Yeah, but what we're talking about is a certain sect of Buddhist monks, ascetic Buddhist monks, who would go to forests to meditate, eventually until they died. They would supposedly go for like 1,000 days. They would subsist on leaves and bark, and then they would bury themselves alive, in scare quotes, to continue that meditation in an underground crypt in order to sort of mummify themselves while still alive. And this is something that really happened. They have some of these mummies on display around Japan, even though scientists now think that they were mummified after they had passed away.
Yeah, and it wasn't just a process of, I'm going to go bury myself in an underground crypt and stop eating and drinking. Like this went on, like you said, for 1,000 days, like almost 3 years.
Yeah.
And they would purposely eat very little amounts and drink very little amounts to mummify themselves, right? Rather than just die.
Yeah. And so this idea, some people for a while said maybe is where people got the idea that this forest is where you might want to go to do this. I don't think that's probably true, but maybe we should take a break and we'll talk about these couple of books that are probably where this idea came from. All right. 1960, there's a short story written by a gentleman named, how would you pronounce that first name?
Seiichi
Matsumoto, yeah?
Yeah.
All right. And it was called Tower of Waves. I always depend on you for Japanese pronunciation.
Well, then technically it's Matsumoto.
What did I say?
Matsumoto.
Okay.
I'm just saying, if you're depending
No,
on me
I
for,
do.
I don't want to misguide you
No,
in front
I
of
want
everybody.
you to. No, that's fine.
Okay.
Why are you hitting me with a ruler right now? It was called Tower of Waves, and it's basically like a Romeo and Juliet-esque plot in that there are these young kids in love who are kept apart by something they can't control. And in the last scene, the woman writes a farewell letter. It's very clearly Romeo and Juliet, and takes a bottle of pills and goes into that very forest to die. And so a lot of people say, well, this is the actual, for the first time, that forest has been linked to a suicide, at least in literature.
Yeah, and that's probably part of it for sure. But I mean, in the same way that the Sokushimbutsu maybe gave people the idea of going off to the woods to die, and this story gave them the idea of going specifically to Aokigahara Forest to die. There was... So we just have to say real quick, the West in particular uses the Japanese approach to suicide as kind of like a prurient lens to like look through and be like, wow, this is like we can shed our own baggage or morality about suicide, because to us, Japanese people are like, sure, kill yourself. That's your jam, right? And that's not fair. That's not how Japanese culture actually views suicide. And in particular, modern Japanese culture abhors suicide and takes pains to prevent it. It's a scar on the national psyche. But back in the day, we would kind of look in on Japan and see that they had like actual rashes of like mass hysteria that would lead teenage girls to go jump in volcanoes, which happened. From the 20s to the 30s. There was one girl in particular, her name was Kyoko, and she threw herself into a volcano, an active volcano, Mount Mahara, that wasn't in Aokigahara Forest, but it was another example of people going to nature to take their own lives. And there was an article in Time from 1935 that basically almost tongue-in-cheek covered this strange phenomenon in Japan. It's not very kind at all, especially if you step back and consider the material. But it's a good example of how we just kind of misunderstand the Japanese approach to suicide. They care about people taking their lives. There's not the like religious morality attached to it.
Right.
It's still tragic. It's just not a slap in the face of God if you do that in their culture.
Yeah, and the government has really come a long way in messaging this stuff out. They have their own, of course, prevention and crisis hotlines and things like that. In this forest, they have trained the employees that work there and the volunteers who work there to look out for people who maybe be by themselves or look troubled. They have security cameras and stuff like that. They have messages in this park, which we'll get to at the end, like the sign at the end. But another book that came along that probably had a lot to do with it as well was written in 1993 in Japanese only, called The Complete Suicide Manual by Wataru Surumi.
That one I'm not doing very well.
Well, I certainly didn't do it.
It's like tsu, right?
Yeah.
But that R really trips you up. So you're like tsurumi, but you have to say it like surumi, and it just comes out like you're like blowing a raspberry.
Right, I gotcha. This is from 1993, like I said, and it is, there's no other way to say it than it is a sort of step-by-step, ins and outs manual of suicide, whether it has merit, what the drawbacks might be, different ways that can happen in order to be successful. And there is a portion of that book that talks about this forest and as the perfect place to die. And some of these manuals apparently have been found with people who have gone to this forest to do just that.
Right.
Here's this beautiful, quiet forest. Your family's not going to stumble upon you.
Right.
You'll just go on this trip and not come back.
And that's the thing. I think a lot of people who do this consider, like, they're considering their families or their friends. They're sparing them from having to find them. But somebody else is going to probably find you, and they're going to be scarred by it. So it's not like this is this doesn't affect anybody, Like it definitely affects the people who live near the forest, the people who volunteer to go clean up the forest, and the police who have to process these bodies too.
So, that's sort of the long and short of it. There, we mentioned a sign because they've taken great measures now to have more awareness on suicide in Japan and especially around the forest. But there are signs in the forest, and as you enter the forest, that say, "Your life is a precious gift from your parents. Please think about your parents, siblings, and children. Don't keep it to yourself. Talk about your troubles," and then has their suicide helpline number included, which is great.
It really is. That's the Aokigahara Forest, one of the most unusual places in Japan and also one of the most beautiful, I've heard.
Yeah, the pictures are amazing.
Yeah. And I guess that's it, right?
That's right.
Okay, everybody. Well, then Short Stuff is out.
Stuff You Should Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.